Hello, I'm the Kentucky Cave Creeper, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the earliest inhabitants that ever entered North America. First of all, I'm going to start out talking about the Clovis people. The Clovis people are the ones that fashioned this style of point. And this point would date to about 13,500 to 14,000 years old, and that's what scientists always widely have accepted, that the Clovis people were the first people to come in to the North American continent. This is the style of spear that they would have had to kill mammoths with, and the reason they know the date is because they found these associated with mammoth bones, and they did a carbon-14 test on it and determined the age. Now I'm going to show you where these people first came in. They're also called the Paleo people. Up here in Alaska, where the Bering Strait is, there was an ice bridge that froze over, and they actually would have came from Siberia, crossed the ice bridge into Alaska, and then populated the United States, is what was always widely believed in the past. But now we have newer evidence of, it's called the Clovis versus coastal migration theory. Now scientists have come up with new discoveries to determine that it's possible that the people even were here earlier, but they still know they came down through the Bering Strait, but they also believe they may have came down through the coast and migrated to other places earlier than they did even possibly in the United States. But the coastal migration theory could have also meant that they came into North America by watercraft of some kind. But there's never been any evidence of that yet, that they used watercraft that long ago. So there's a place called Monte Verde that's down here in South America, in Brazil here, and down there were Chile, near Chile, and Monte Verde dated to about, there were some tests done there around probably over 30,000 years ago. So it sort of suggested that that there was pre-Clovis cultures, stuff earlier than the Clovis man. Pre-Clovis culture came in to North America and possibly South America earlier than the Clovis people. So that's some of the new theories that they've come up with. And also there's a group of ancient people called the Solutreans. Now they were over here in Europe probably 20,000 years ago, and the style of point they made is really a whole lot like this Clovis point without the flute, maybe a skinnier version. So there's so much similarities that they think maybe the Solutreans actually came from Europe via watercraft into North America and hit the East Coast and populated in that way, and that maybe that's who the Clovis people were. But they still the scientists just simply don't know. I mean, there's just too many unanswered questions, but what we do know is now, definitely, we know that there was pre-Clovis cultures, because on the eastern coast of the United States, there's sites that date much earlier than 14,000 years, like the Meadowcroft Shelter and Cactus Hill, and different places. And so it's widely accepted that definitely, probably pre-Clovis cultures were here before the Clovis people. Now we don't know exactly all their ages yet, but we think maybe even as early as 40 or 50,000 years. Some scientists even say it's a possibility North America was populated that early. But another point I'd like to talk about right here is, I'm going to show you another Clovis. Well, I'll show you another Clovis point. And yet another one. And they're all different shapes and sizes. Like I said again, this style of point would have dated 13,500 to 14,000 years ago, and they have these distinctive flutes in them where the stick was tied. Okay, another point that came along a little bit later is called the Folsom point. Right there so you can see it. The Folsom point was probably manufactured around 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. And it's fluted. This one's fluted on both sides, but sometimes they're fluted on one side, both sides, or maybe not fluted at all. But they have a really wide flute on them, so they're a different style, but sort of similar and still associated with the Paleo period. And then one more earlier point I want to show is what we call the Cumberland point. Now these generally have longer flutes. Sometimes, then again, these were fluted on one side, both sides, or no sides. And Clovises are also the same way. And there's that style of point, and that was probably 8,000 to 11,000 years ago. The Folsom and the Cumberland are a little later than the Clovis. And that's just one example of some of the earliest points that they have recovered and been able to positively date. But what's going on is, let me show you first, let you get one good look at these. They're all Clovises. And then we got the Cumberland and the Folsom. The rest are Clovis. Okay. Now, the point I want to make, the whole reason that I'm standing here talking about this today is because this is the earliest points that we know about that we can positively date are the Clovis, and that we have a real good date on, and it's always, like I said, been believed that the Clovis people were first until now. There's other stuff that they found, and they now think, of course, we have pre-Clovis cultures that were here in North America. And another thing I'd like to talk about real quick is, let me again use this to point with. Up here in Europe, you have the Neanderthals. Probably in Europe and Asia, Neanderthals probably lived around 600,000 years ago, all the way up to maybe 24,000 years ago when they died out, sometime around 30,000 years ago. Okay, now we have no idea and no proof at all that Neanderthals ever entered North America, except for some amateur archaeologists have made some discoveries that implicate possibly that there could have been the presence of Neanderthals here. Very small stuff found, but no one knows for sure. It's not been scientifically examined or proven to a proof positive fact yet that they were ever here. And I'm not implying that they were ever on this continent. But we do know the Clovis people were here. We don't know whether the Clovis people would have been some kind of, somehow intertwined with Neanderthals, or if they're a separate group of people. We just simply don't know much about them because there's never been any bones of a Clovis person found with the style of points to indicate that, to show us whether they're Caucasian or Native American, but we believe they're probably Native American. But we just simply don't know until we find a body with the points to determine the race. So, like I said a while ago, we are not sure if Neanderthals were ever here, but more than likely they weren't. There's no proof, but the whole reason I'm here today is I want to tell a story. The reason I'm discussing this is I want to tell a story that a very good friend of mine, who is now deceased, told me about 20 years ago, or maybe longer than that, back in the 80s. He told me this story. And in the early 60s, this gentleman, he started out, I guess, collecting artifacts and stuff, and was a major collector and very knowledgeable. And he was also president of a gem and mineral club for years. He was a very well-respected, honest, church-going, hard-working individual, and a good person. And he was well-respected in the archaeological community. I'd actually worked on some paleo digs as a volunteer with a group of archaeologists, and he even brought some Clovis Points up, and they took him serious and measured his points and looked them over, and he knew his stuff. I mean, the man knew human anatomy. He knew everything about the human body, knew what human bones look like. He also knew what animal bones look like, and was very knowledgeable in replicas, fakes, and everything. So in the 60s, the story goes like this. This gentleman, which was an elderly gentleman when he passed away, he had went with a friend of his to a very remote spot deep in the Kentucky wilderness, to a shelter. And he had discovered some very early arrowheads there, deep in the ground. And some probably at least dating 8,000-9,000 years ago. And definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, this site was occupied by prehistoric man, because there are evidence of flint tools, there are evidence of bone tools, and there are evidence of clamshells that they had. And he had found a cranium in the ground. The cranium was something unlike anything he had ever found. And he had told me that he had found a sloped forehead, a very thick piece of skull, the top of a cranium with a sloped forehead, very thick, and a heavy brow ridge. I showed him pictures similar to this one I took off the internet of a Neanderthal. We really sat down and talked about this, and every time we talked about it, he said that's what he found. I mean, when I showed him these pictures, he said it was not like the modern human skull. He said he believed it was a Neanderthal skull. And at the time, I guess he just didn't think anything about what it really thought much about it at the time, and he put it back in the ground and buried it back. And so when I found out the story, I asked him, I said, I'm very interested in this, could you take me to the site? And I was fortunate enough to get to go to the site with this gentleman before he died, about 20 years ago. And upon arrival, he could not recover the skull. He actually we weren't there very long. He didn't make any major effort to find it. He just more or less showed me the area. But he just couldn't, he forgot exactly where he put it, and couldn't quite, he just never recovered. So as far as we're concerned, the skull is still there. And I know some very early arrowheads were found at this site. Whether this skull was a paleo person, a Neanderthal, or what it was. We're not sure. If it was some kind of deformity, maybe he's outside the box and it's just a deformed skull. But I talked to him in detail. He said it was not animal. He said it was not a modern human skull, but like the Neanderthal skull, the cranium, sloped forehead, heavy brow ridge, very thick skull. I will never disclose this location for fear of looters, vandalizers. This site is one that I hope someday, when I become a scientist, which I'm halfway there, that I can bring a team down there and we'll investigate this further and get to the bottom of this mystery. Being a former police officer, I know the importance of an investigation and not to destroy and disturb. And hopefully we can keep this place intact, and it can warrant further investigation in the future. And I hope in my next segment to make a trip to this site, which I will not reveal again this site, but would like to